A few days ago, I made a video on how to use the map function in Excel, and a lot of people commented and asked me what's the difference between the map function and the BYROW function. And many of them also pointed out that the examples I used can use either map function or BYROW function and it would give the same result. So I thought I'll make another separate video and show you the difference between these two functions, and in many cases you can actually use them interchangeably, but there is a difference. So in this video I'm going to show you a lot of examples on how these functions are actually different. So let me first start by the syntax and what these functions are. So the BYROW function would take a range as an input, and then it is going to apply a lambda function that you can specify within the formula on each row of the range. In comparison, map function is going to apply that lambda on each cell, which means that if you, let's say, have a range that has 10 rows, then BYROW function is going to apply that formula on 10 rows, but map function is going to apply on each cell. So if you have 10 rows and 2 columns, then map function is going to do the computation 20 times, one for each cell. Now the syntax is also different. If you look at the BYROW function, we have the array. So you can see I have the array here and the lambda function. But if you look at the map function, it can take multiple parallel arrays in the same formula, and then the last argument is going to be the lambda function. Now this is a major difference. I am going to show you an example on how it impacts the result of both of these functions. Now in the BYROW function, it takes one single array. As I showed you here, it only takes one single array. It could be many different, it could be many rows, it could be many columns, but it would be one single array. But in the map function, you can use multiple arrays. So you can have multiple arrays. They need to be of the same size, but they could be multiple parallel arrays. Now in the BYROW function, as I mentioned, the computation is row by row. So if your range has 10 rows, then it is going to do the calculation for each row 10 times in that formula. But in the map function, it is going to be cell by cell. So map function does more computation, or at least the equal number of computations as compared to the BYROW function. And the result, which is very important, is BYROW function is going to give you the result in one single column, and the map function is going to preserve the input array. So if in map function you give it the input, which is 10 rows and 2 columns, then the output result would also be 10 rows and 2 columns. But in BYROW function, if you give the same array to the BYROW function, it would just give you one single column of 10 values. Now let's see a couple of examples on how these functions are same or different. So here I have this example where I have this data, and in this map function, let's say I want to multiply each of these values by 2. So if I use the map function, I would take this entire thing as the array, and then I would specify the lambda functions. So in this case, let's use lambda and then x, where x is going to represent one cell at a time from the range that I have given to the map function as the first argument. And then I can specify the formula, which in this case, let's say x multiplied by 2. So if I hit enter, it is going to give me this result where each value has been multiplied by 2. So you can see that map function took one value at a time and multiplied it by 2. Now this is not a really good example of map function. You can actually just select the range and multiply it by 2. So you don't need to use the map function, but just wanted to show you that it works on cell by cell. But if I do the same thing for BYROW, see what happens. With BYROW, I would take this array, and then in lambda, if I use x comma x into 2 and I hit enter, it gives me a calculation error. And the reason for this is that in this case, in the map function, when I used lambda, x represented one cell at a time, so the value from one cell at a time. But when I used the same thing in the BYROW function, x actually represents each row in this range. So in this case, x actually does not represent one value, it represents the entire row, which means that I cannot do this kind of calculation, because this calculation for each row, I'm trying to multiply the entire row by 2, and BYROW function, as I mentioned, can only give you result in one single column. It cannot give you the result in the column as well as the row. So in this case, BYROW function is not going to work. However, if you want to aggregate this, for example, instead of me trying to multiply these, if I want to get the sum of the entire row, I can do that. So I can use sum and then x. And now when I hit enter, it would give me the result, because when I'm using sum x, it is doing the sum of the entire row. So it takes all these values and gives me the sum of it. Now let's see another example in which case map is not going to work, but BYROW is going to work. So here, if I use the map function, take this range as the input, And then let's say I want to get the average of all of these values. Now, if I can create a lambda function, but because average is already a built-in function within the lambda, I can just use average function here and it is going to give me the result. See what happens when I hit enter? It gives me the same result here because it is taking one cell at a time and doing the average of that one single cell, which is going to be the same value. But if I do the same thing with BYROW, here I take this array and then I use the average function, you'll see that it gives me the right result because BYROW is computing each row at a time. So it takes the entire row and does the calculation, which is finding the average of each value. So while both of these formulas are going to give us the result, it is BYROW that actually does the aggregation because BYROW is meant for it. Map function is meant to take one cell at a time and do whatever operation you want to do on that cell. Now let's see a multi-column example. As I mentioned, that map function can take multiple parallel arrays. So for example, in this case, let's say I use map function with this array here and this array here. So I can have multiple arrays here and then I can, let's say, find the maximum of these two columns. So I can just use the max function. Now what it's going to do is it is going to pick one value from this range, and then give me the maximum of those two values, then go to the next row. See what happens when I hit enter? It gives me 14 because 14 is bigger than 13 here, but 16 is bigger than 11 and so on. So it compares these two rows and gives me the maximum value. But I cannot do the same thing with the BYROW function because BYROW function by design can only take one single array. So if I try and use this value and comma, I try this, now it has already run out of arguments. If I try and specify average as the last one and I hit enter, you can see it says you have entered too many arguments for this function because this function can only take two arguments. So you cannot work with multiple arrays. However, I can work with one single array that can have multiple columns. For example, instead of A2 to A6, I can have A2 to D6 and that would work perfectly fine. It is going to give me the average. In this case, I wanted max, sorry, so I would use max here and it is going to give me the max value for each row. So you can see BYROW can only take one single array, but map function can take parallel arrays and the result of the map function would be the same size of each individual array. So in this case, it is going to give me one single column. Had these been, let's say, 5 rows and 3 columns, then it would give me the same result, which is going to be 5 rows and 3 columns. So it always matches the input array size. Now, here is one very interesting thing. So let's say I use the map function, let's say first, and I take this array and then I want to know what is the kind of value that is being passed into the map function. So when the map function uses this array, what is the value it is actually passing on to the lambda function? So in this case, I can use the lambda function or I can just use this function called type and see what happens. It gives me 1. Now let me show you the help for the type function. So here, if I scroll down, you can see it is going to return 1 if the value in the cell is a number. If it is a text, it is going to return 2. And if it is an array, it is going to return 64. So let's close this and let's go back. So as you can see, when I used map function with the type function, so when I'm trying to identify the type of each of these cell values that is being passed to the map function, it gives me 1 because it is a numeric value. If I make it 2, it gives me, sorry, if I make it text, then it gives me 2 here because this is a text value. But let's see what happens when I do the same thing with the BYROW function. So if I use BYROW here, you can see it gives me 64 because BYROW function is taking the entire row, which means that it is taking the entire array. So it's not one single scalar value, it is the entire range, which means it is going to give me 64. But if I have one single column, then map function and BYROW function, there is no difference. You can use map function or you can use BYROW function. It is going to give you the same result. And let me show you. So here I have map function. I take this range and when I use type, it gives me 1, which means that a scalar value, which is 13, 11, 17, these are being passed on to the map function. But if I do the same thing with the BYROW function here, you'll see even in this case, BYROW function is going to get the scalar value. So if you have one single column or one single cell and you're using the map function or BYROW function, doesn't matter, you can use them interchangeably. But if you have multiple rows of data, multiple columns of data, then BYROW function gets the entire row. But if it is just one single cell or one single column, BYROW is going to get the value in the cell. And this is why most of the times you will see that people can use BYROW function and map function interchangeably, because map function, if applied on the single column, can easily be replaced by BYROW function, and it is going to give you the same result. Now let's see another example here. And in this case, as I mentioned, if it is one single cell, you can interchangeably use map function or the BYROW function. But here, this is a different example. I have one single cell, but I cannot use map or BYROW interchangeably, and I'll show you why. So in this case, let's say I use the map function, and within the map function, let's say I want to split this data. So I have this entire array 10, 20, 30. So I would use text split, and then this is the text, and then let's split it based on comma. So now if I check this, it is going to give me the array which is 10, 20, 30. And let's say I want to add these. So I would just use the sum here. And you can see it gives me this value 10, 20, 30. Now the reason this is giving me 10, 20, 30 in this case is because it has this array, and on this array it's trying to give me the sum. I can use sum, and obviously for each individual value, so it's just adding 10 and 20 and 30 separately, so it's just giving me the same value. But if I try and do the same thing with BYROW, see what happens. If I come here and I use BYROW, it gives me 0 because these values are text values. So if I come here and I make it, let's say this, it gives me 60. If I come here and I make it negative here, it would still give me 10, 20, 30, and this gives me 60. So you can see I cannot interchangeably use these functions even if it is a single cell. And the reason for this is that it's not really the cell, it's actually what is being passed into the map function. Here, I'm not actually passing one single cell, I'm passing an array which is 10, 20, 30, and in BYROW also I'm passing the entire row. So BYROW takes the entire row, gives me the sum, map function takes the entire row and applies the sum function on each individual value and gives me the same value. So although in most cases you will see that BYROW and map can be used interchangeably for one single cell or for one single column, if the value that is being passed to the lambda function is something different, it's not that cell, it's being manipulated, it's being broken, it's become an array, then the result could be different. And now let me show you an example where you can use BYROW function, but it is not going to give you the right result. So you have to use the map function. So here I have this data, and in each cell you'll see that there is a repetition. For example, Alice, Bob, Alice. So the name repeats. Now I want to use a function that is going to go through all of these cells and then only give me the unique names. So let's do one thing. Let's create that formula here first, and then we will extrapolate it and make it into a BYROW or a map function. Let's just make one single formula first. So in this case, I would use the text split function, where this is the text, and let's split it based on the comma followed by space character. So now if I hit enter, it gives me these three names in three separate cells, and I only want unique values here. Now if I try and use the unique function on this, it wouldn't work, because somehow unique doesn't work if the array is horizontal, but if the array is vertical. So if I come here and I split it not in the same row but in the same column, it is going to work. So now it has given me these two names, so the duplicate value is gone. Now I can just combine it again, so I can use text join, and within text join the delimiter, let's make it comma followed by space character, and this is my text. And now when I hit enter, it gives me the right result where the duplicate name has been removed. Now let's convert it into the map function. So I'd use map function, take this entire range, and then use the lambda function. And within lambda, I have x, which is going to get the cell one cell at a time. And then I'm going to pass this x value. So instead of a2, I'm going to use x here. And now when I hit enter, it gives me the result. Let's copy this here. So delete it from here. Let's put it in this case, and you can see it gives me the right result. All these cells have names and there is no repetition. But if I try and replace this with BYROW, see what happens. BYROW only gives me the result in one single column, and the reason, again going back to the first thing I told you, BYROW would always give you the result in one single column, and it cannot give you the result in the column as well as multiple columns, but map function will maintain the original array dimension that I put in here. So in here, if I change it to map, it is going to maintain the dimensions of A2 to C11. So it would give me the output result, which is the same dimension as A2 to C11. So this is why it gives me the right result. So this is a scenario where you should not be using the BYROW function, you should be using the map function. So these are the differences I wanted to show you in this video. I hope this has made it somewhat clear how these two functions are different. The main criteria is that map function can work with multiple arrays. BYROW function can only work with one single array, and the output that you get from BYROW can be one single column. Map function can actually maintain and preserves the dimension of the input array that you give it. So this is the major difference. In most cases, you would still see that people use these functions interchangeably, but at least you would have the fair idea of what function should be used and where map can be used, where BYROW is not going to work. That's it in this video. I hope you found this useful. Also, if you're liking these videos, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and click on the bell icon so that you never miss out on any new Excel tips video I come up with. Thank you and have a nice day.